Let's talk and Q&A for your book. Now, as an introduction to Claire, she grew up in Colorado. Over the past 13 years, has been living abroad, collecting stories and experiences that she can turn into novels. We Rule the Night has received 4-star reviews to date and has been called a fierce and compelling breakout debut that should not be missed. Publishers Weekly says, Bartlett's electrifying feminist fantasy debut uses keenly raw characters, harrowing action sequences, and creative yet economical world building to explore misogynistic military culture and the human cost of war. Claire currently lives in Denmark and is so happy to be here today.
Thank you.
Sorry for the bad.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you everybody for coming. I wanted to first start out by talking about the people who inspired the book. Then we'll do a Q&A. Then we'll do signing. If anybody is missing a copy of the book, look at all these beautiful copies. And they're 20% off, even though there's no sticker on them. So, just an FYI. But this book is based off of the Night Witches, which is a segment of Russian history that I never personally knew about before reading about it in 2014. I think that generally we don't study Russian history too much in the United States, except in an us versus them capacity. And when we study history, we tend to focus on certain parts of it, mostly male-dominated parts, and the rest of the stories get lost. Sometimes they get lost forever, or almost forever. I definitely know my share of academics who are fighting to keep stories that nobody cares about alive. And sometimes they make a comeback, like the Night Witches are doing right now. So, the Night Witches, they were the first women's combat regiment in modern history. They had 300 plus members in 3 years, from 1942 to 1945, and each of them flew up to 1,000 sorties between the regiment's founding and the end of the war. So, they did a lot, and I never heard about them until 5 years ago. For a brief history lesson, because I love history, huge history nerd, in 1941, Operation Barbarossa hit the Soviet Union. It was Hitler's invasion into Russia. In 1941, on June 22nd, the operation started. By the time it had finished in December, 21,000 Soviet planes had been destroyed. Their aircraft division was extremely depleted, and they didn't know what to do. So, enter our first heroine of the day, Marina Raskova. She was a personal friend of Stalin, and she was a famous aviator. She'd earned her name by flying with 2 other women aviators across the Soviet Union a few years before. They made a 30-hour flight. It was the longest flight any woman had made to that date. And she became famous when a storm hit their plane about 18 hours into the flight. They lost a lot of altitude. They didn't know what to do. So Marina grabbed a parachute and bailed so that her pilot could gain altitude and survive. She was lost in the Russian winter landscape for 10 days before she was rescued by Soviet forces. So of course this made her a national hero and a household name. And when war broke out in 1941, she traded on that fame to form 3 all-women's regiments. She formed a night bombing regiment, a day bombing regiment, and a fighter regiment. By the end of the war, only the night bombing regiment was all female. The other 2 had integrated. So, gender equality was a really funny thing in the Soviet Union. When Marxism became the name of the day, it was stated that women and men should be equal. And that meant that both girls and boys attended rifle practice. They both trained with the Komsomol, which was basically communist Boy Scouts. They also did a lot of flying. A lot of women joined like air clubs, aviation clubs, and they learned how to fly, particularly when Marina Raskova gained so much fame doing her 30-hour flight. So by the time war had broken out, there were a lot of trained young women who knew how to fly. But when they went to join the regiment, they were often turned down by the male bureaucrats who were in charge of placing them. Some of them begged until they gave in. Some of them went out of their way to prove that they could do it. My favorite story is one woman wrote to Stalin asking permission to go to the front in her home-built tank so that she could do it. And finally, many of them were allowed to come in, they were recruited, and they were trained up. And a little while later, they were split into their 3 separate sections. The 588th Night Bombing Regiment was the official name of the Night Witches, and it was the least desirable section to be in. They were not doing glamorous assignments like the flyers and the fighters. Their job was to drop stuff, basically. They would drop mostly bombs, but also leaflets, propaganda. They would drop bricks and railroad ties. Sometimes they would drop supplies to their own men when they were isolated, and occasionally they would drop men who would get into these tubes on the wing of their plane and fly out to a drop site. So they dropped stuff, and to drop their stuff, they had a little plane, which I sort of wish I had a photograph of, but I don't. It was the Polikarpov PO2. It was a biplane, a crop duster, and a training plane that had been turned into this weapon of war. The Polikarpov top speed, is 94 miles per hour. That can be compared to the most famous German plane of the time, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Their top speed is 379 miles per hour. The Polikarpov speed was actually an advantage to them. It's the only biplane that has been credited with a jet kill. A Lockheed Starfire attempted to slow down fast enough to catch the Polikarpov. It stalled and it flew itself right out of the air by accident. So, oftentimes, superior enemy planes could not actually catch the Polikarpov PO2, but they made up for that by attacking from the ground. The Polikarpov little engine couldn't fly high enough without freezing, which meant that it flew about 300 feet above the ground at its lowest point and could be shot at by a German rifle. And when weighed down with bombs, of course, they struggled to lift off from the ground, which meant that the Night Witches emptied the cockpit of anything they deemed extraneous, such as parachutes. They figured they flew so close to the ground and their canvas and wood biplanes were so flammable that it didn't make a difference anyway. And too often they were right. And perhaps the most depressing fact about the Soviet Union, if someone did land in enemy territory and got captured or disappeared, the Soviet Union automatically assumed that they had committed treason and defected. So if you survived in enemy territory, it didn't matter anyway. So many of them didn't bother with the parachutes. They would rather die and be heroes. So, despite all of this, these terrible planes, they earned respect. They developed a particular tactic. They would cruise up to the target, shut off their engines, dive down silently, drop the targets, and then reach up to the front and crank the engine until it was going again so that they could take off. This tactic earned them the name the Night Witches. The Germans named them for the silence of the broom as it dove. Over and over again, they would do this up to 18 times per night, sometimes venturing out onto the wing of the plane in order to loosen a sticky trigger. So, all in all, the women formed close bonds with each other. They didn't follow the usual army protocol, which meant that oftentimes, instead of receiving orders, they received requests, which they followed anyway. This meant that they had very strong bonds of friendship that weren't usually distinguished by rank. They didn't pay too much attention to it. And they were often more relaxed around each other, which sometimes irritated their male counterparts, who were very used to the strict army regimen. But they stood on less ceremony. They were still respectful and obedient. They knew that they had to prove that they were as good as their male counterparts in the army, even though their counterparts were getting much better planes. So their routine became very strict in order to survive this and to thrive in spite of it. They usually did that the pilot flew to the drop site and dropped the bomb while the navigator was asleep in the back. Then the navigator would wake up and take over for the pilot, and the pilot would go to sleep on the way back. And that was how they managed to run their night missions. While other men would take a break and stretch their legs and get out of the cockpit while their plane was getting refueled and rearmed, the Night Witches would stay there. They would take a cup of tea. As soon as things were ready again, they would take back off. Their last battle was the Battle of Berlin in 1945, and they celebrated the end of the war at the Brandenburg Gate. And then, of course, they all had to wonder what comes afterwards. Some of them stayed in the army. There was no official ban in the Soviet Union on women serving in the army, just a social ban. Some of them flew commercial aircraft. Some of them went home. They did something completely different. But to me, the most tragic part was that the Soviet Union excluded the exploits of the women who fought from stories and propaganda about the war afterward. And of course, the United States was obsessed with the communist threat and not terribly interested in stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. So the tale of the Soviet women in combat first had to be championed in the USSR and then abroad. And it first came to an English language book in 1984. I first came across The Night Witches in 2014. Personally, I connected to this feeling of working in male-dominated space and of being attached to a country that didn't care about me and didn't have my best interests at heart. So I decided to write about women who did their best, who loved a country that would never love them back, and who relied on each other and supported each other to succeed. And that has resulted in this book. So I want to read to it, or from it, to you. I want to read the second chapter. The first chapter's been online for about 6 months. If you haven't read the first chapter, it doesn't matter, because they're not really connected. So I can do both. And before I read from my book, I want to draw your attention to the dedication page. It says, "To my grandmother, Lorraine Bowling, who worked in the Air Force and never let her male-dominated society, or anyone for that matter, dictate how she would manage her life." And this is my grandma. Gonna come over and give you a kiss, Grandma. Love you bunches. So, I'm gonna read. If I can find the chapter spot, I should have put a thing in it. All right. Chapter 2. I give my son gladly. Lene stood at attention outside her colonel's office, cursing herself. Colonel Coslin's voice cut through the thin walls, and she caught words such as honor, disgrace, and stupidity as he blasted the unlucky Lieutenant Tama with the full force of his wrath. Lene's blood sang. She'd be trembling if she let herself relax. But that was her secret to being in the army. Never let your guard down. That had been her secret to being in the army. Then she'd been stupid and allowed her guard to slip. Now she was here. The few men who walked by shot her curious glances. She ignored them all, as she'd ignored the catcalls from those who thought the humiliating discovery of her sex was somehow hilarious. When she realized the game was up, she'd swiped some brandy from under Tanov's bed, hoping to fortify herself. She'd taken only a swig or two, but now she couldn't decide whether it was the brandy or the fear that turned her thoughts upside down. The slate sky gave way to a bleed of color with twilight, and the temperature was fast dropping toward night. Clouds piled on the horizon, as they always did in early autumn, becoming darker and colder, until they finally rushed in to unleash the first howling storms. The shouting ceased. Lene wished she'd had time for a Racidine cigarette. Maybe she should have taken the rest of Tanov's bottle. The door creaked. Tanov's voice came from over her shoulder. "The colonel wants to see you, Private." He stopped. Miss. He said it like he didn't even know her. They'd served together for 3 years. Tanov had screamed at her, sworn at her, threatened her, punished her. She'd gotten him drunk the night before his promotion, and she'd shot the Elda by steadying her rifle on his shoulder. When she roared at a charging Elda soldier, he'd laughed and called her Little Lion, and everyone in the regiment followed suit. Once, they'd sworn they'd get their Hero of the Union medals together. Now he averted his eyes and stepped smartly to the side, leaving the door open for her. "March, soldier," she told her feet. She could do that at least, even with the cocktail of rage, nerves, and brandy inside her. Colonel Coslin's office smelled of sweat, earth, and oil. Papers lay scattered across his desk, the aftermath of a bureaucratic war. Coslin stood behind the desk, clinching and unclinching his ham hands as Lene came in. The colonel cut an impressive figure, tall and broad, with biceps the size of Linnée's head. Tanov and their friend Ostrov had joked that before the war, Kozlin was a goat herd who liked the smell of goats better than the smell of women. Linné preferred to mock his glorious mustache, waxed to a curl. It twitched whenever he spoke, whenever he sighed, whenever he lost his temper, or whenever it seemed a particularly difficult thought was pushing itself through the sludge of his brain. After any ordinary disciplinary action, Linné would return to the barracks with her finger over her upper lip, wiggling it back and forth as she described Kozlin's temper. No one would laugh at the joke now. They laughed at her. Kozlin studied her round face, her dark hair, her thin body, searching out the little touches that branded her as female. Linné pushed her shoulders back, daring him to say something. They stood that way for several long moments. Then he sighed. Please, take a seat. He gestured toward his chair, the nice chair. Would you like some tea? Linnée's palms began to burn. For 3 years, he treated her like a soldier, and suddenly she was a girl, a miss. She fought to keep her face neutral. If she took his offer, she'd be relegated to the status of a woman, an outsider, unfit to serve. If she refused, he could claim that she was incapable of following orders. Kozlin went over to a silver samovar, squeezed onto a side table next to the company's hulking radio. Wasting precious metal had become a serious offense around 2 years ago, when the heads of the Union had realized just how bad the war was about to get. But officers always managed to squirrel something nice away. Linné slid into the hard chair, reserved for the colonel's subordinates, sitting rigid with her wrists crossed on the desk. Thank you, sir. Kozlin stopped mid-step toward the chair she'd taken for herself. Then he turned and went to his own, as though he'd meant to all along. He placed one cup of pale golden tea in front of her and took a sip from the other. You've turned our little regiment quite upside down, miss. His tone was all exaggerated courtesy. A gentleman could never shout at a lady. Have I, sir? Kozlin frowned. The mustache twitched as he inhaled slowly and deliberately. He could smell the brandy on her. She should have left it alone. He was silent for a moment, and behind his eyes she saw some sort of argument raging. Then he seemed to make up his mind. I'm not going to waste time. If you have no shame for your actions, perhaps you should consider how you have endangered the men of your company. Linné pressed her lips together. Arguing got a soldier latrine duty, or graveside duty, or watches for the witching hours. Perhaps he mistook her silence for contrition. War is simply not women's work, he said. Though apparently it is goatherd's work, Linné thought. She couldn't help herself. She imagined her next words running along an iron beam, strong and steady. If her voice shook, Kozlin might think she was close to tears, instead of holding back her rage. I have served faithfully, sir. I have been loyal to the Union and the regiment. You have distracted the men, Kozlin replied. They cannot spend their time at the front, worrying for your safety. Don't you understand? You don't just endanger their lives by coming out here. You endanger their minds, their ability to think. Cowards. She recognized the lie, even if Kozlin didn't. The men were afraid that she could no longer do her job. They were afraid that she'd never been able to do her job, that every mistake she'd ever made was because she was a girl and not because she was human. I admire your heart and your courage, and the Union appreciates the enthusiasm with which you have risen to serve. Then why not keep me? She burst out. Damn it, she had to stay calm. She wouldn't let Kozlin's last memory of her be some hysterical thing who confirmed his suspicions. We've just lowered the draft age, again. I can fight better than the new recruits. Kozlin's jaw clenched. Everyone has a place in this war mess, and I'm certain we can find a role for you. A role that suits you, that helps the men focus and provide stability and strength to the armed forces. Won't that be best for the Union? A role. He was bullshitting her to agree to be some administrator in the city while her friends went to the front. No one won a Hero of the Union medal by sitting behind a desk. He pricked at her eyes, and for the first time, Linné worried she might cry in front of the colonel. She had to say something before her fate was sealed, but she didn't know what. Kozlin pulled out her file. He examined the photograph, then the photo. Her bronze skin was washed out by the flash, which only made the freckles across her nose more prominent. The photo made her look defiant. It dared anyone who saw her to underestimate her. It is me, she said. I beg your pardon. The photograph. I didn't fake it or anything. I see. But I presume Alexei Nabiev is not your real name. Kozlin dipped a smooth glass-tipped pin into an inkwell and drew a line over Linnée's alternate identity. 3 years of her life, 3 years of faith and loyalty, erased from record. Whom do I have the pleasure of addressing? Lene Alexei Solomov, she said. She deliberately left the feminine A off the end of her name. His pen jumped across the page, trailing a streak of thick black ink. Crosland cursed and blotted at the paper. Lene turned her snort into a cough, though her amusement stalled as he scrawled her real name in a free, unblemished space. He focused on her photo again, but this time he was looking for someone else. He was trying to see her tall, pale father in the lines of her face and figure. He wouldn't find the resemblance. She took after her mother in far too many ways, including her looks. Your father's name? Alexei Ilyazolomov, she confirmed. General, hero of the Union, second commander of all land units in the armed forces. He'd been called the fourth most powerful man in the nation. At home, he'd once joked it was lucky he had such influence over the first three. His voice rose to a squeak. Does your father know you're here? Lene took a moment to savor the sheer panic on his face. Of course not. Her father was powerful, but even he had rules. Crosland's eyes rested on the scrawl he'd made. She could see the battle raging behind them, or perhaps, more important, behind his mustache. Would you wait outside for a few minutes, miss? Yes, sir, she added. Crosland ignored the jab. As she left, she heard the whir of the radio starting up. The air outside was crisp and thin, compared with the stuffy interior of the colonel's office. Lene took a deep breath. Maybe, if she thought of a convincing enough argument, Crosland would reconsider. She could tally her confirmed kills, her sharpshooter skills, her last score on the Spark exams. She could remind him of the time she'd saved his life by caving in the skull of an elder soldier. Not that she particularly wanted to remember that herself. Her thoughts evaporated. Tanov stood outside the office with the patient expression of a soldier who might, at any moment, be called back in for another verbal beating. Dostrov stood next to him, his stoic look marred by the dead end of a cigarette clamped between his lips. He'd once said he joined the army to save money on Racidine, and Lene was only 3/4 certain that was a lie. The sour smoke drifted in a perpetual cloud around his head. The fiery hues of sunset had turned to deeper colors behind them, and no doubt they had better places to be. What were they doing here? Don't let your guard down. So, Tanov said at last. So what, she wanted to ask. But that would invariably lead to, so, you're a girl, which would be a stupid way to start a conversation after he'd been the one to walk in on her without her shirt. And enough bureaucratic garbage had spewed from Crosland's maw to fill her with rage for months. Dostrov spat his cigarette butt into the grill. The barracks were quiet around them as the men went in for dinner on the other side of the base. The few living metal constructions that passed were little messengers, scuttling like brainless spiders as they ferried notes and small supplies. Lene forced herself to ignore the boys next to her, rather than wonder at their strange, silent vigil. They stayed that way for some minutes. Then Tanov said, "How'd you do it?" Light crackled over Tanov's fingers, tiny pops of spark magic that flashed as they disappeared into the weed. He'd always been the worst of them with his spark, but he wasn't paying any mind to the way it flickered. He gazed at her with earnest, too bright eyes. Maybe he'd been at the brandy himself. 3 years! I never suspected. He turned to Dostrov. Did you know? Of course not, said Dostrov, looking up at a break in the cloud cover where the first bright stars of the night peered through. What little hope Lene had shriveled away. Maybe they didn't catcall, but she wasn't good old Alexei anymore. I've never even seen you piss. Urinate, Tanov said. Dostrov punched his shoulder. Just stop, she snapped. Tanov stiffened. He looked hurt in a way he'd never looked when she lost her temper or hit him, or stolen his cigarettes or beaten him at cards, and she knew why. And all the things she needed to say bottled up in her throat, refusing to come out as anything but righteous fury. I'll stop there. Now we have Q&A, if anyone has Q's.
How long did it take you to draft the first one?
How long did it take me to draft the first
version, and then how many drafts did you
version
go through before you reached this?
Okay. Yeah. How many drafts and how long did it take me? So I started drafting in November 2014, and I was done in early 2016 with the first draft. And then I did a couple of edits on my own. Then I went out looking for a literary agent. Then my literary agent and I did a draft edit on our own. And then we went out looking for publishers. And then with the publisher, we did 4 separate edits. So in total, like 7. Yeah. But that's a big part of working with an editor, is they have a vision for how the novel's going to go. And you've got to work to get there also.
The 4 edits that you had to make once the publisher was on board, was it like character development? Was it plot stuff? I don't know if there's anything you can tell us without giving it away.
What was the...
Like, did you have to essentially rewrite the whole book, or was it just like this piece?
It feels like it. There was a lot of line stuff. Like, I think we probably cut 5,000 words, but then added 5,000 more words from other things that weren't clear.
Yeah.
There was definitely, not everyone was totally clear on like the magic system, so more had to go in there. We clarified Revna's character arc, who's the other main character that I didn't read from. And the last edit, we did totally change the ending. Like probably the last quarter of the book was completely different.
Wow.
Getting that letter was a fun day. It was so hard.
Was it hard for you to change what you had written from the public?
Was it hard to change? No, because I really liked my editor. And her vision aligned ultimately with like the thematic ideas of the book. So all the suggestions she made sense, which was great. I was up with a different editor who wanted to make totally different changes for the book. And I think that would have been much more of a struggle, because she wanted to make the entire book very, very different. So I'm happy. I'm happy with how it turned out. Like the biggest challenge was thinking that, yeah, it needs to change. How am I going to change it? So.
Is this the first book that you sent off like to query?
Yes, yeah. It's the 4th one I wrote though over the years between high school and now.
Do you think you'll revisit any of those earlier books and current publishers?
No.
Yeah.
Some people do. There's another woman in my debut group who's been working on like the same book for 10 years, and now it's getting published. But I definitely learned a lot of things between now and then that I'd like to apply to something new.
Yeah.
How did you know this was the book to query with?
That's so hard. I think I knew when I was writing this book that I wanted it published more than any book I had written before. So it was a goal from the very beginning. And then I also I took classes on editing and I sent it to people and I was getting really good feedback. So I figured I should go with it. I also entered a couple of contests and I got really good feedback. So that was cool.
Do you envision it as a series or a standalone?
I'd love for it to be a series. We'll have to see what happens. So the more people you make buy this book, the more likely it is that we'll get a series out of it. It's doing critically very well, so we'll see how the numbers reflect it in the next few weeks. Yes.
Your audience, are they, what is it called, young adult?
Young adults. Yeah, my audience is young adults. Young adult, a lot of adults read it. So,
Well, yeah, Harry Potter, right?
yeah,
Every adult
yes.
reads Harry Potter.
And of course, that is like the ultimate goal for writing children's literature, is writing a book that both the kid and the adult want to read. But a lot of adults read young adult. I think young adult is in many ways more a style of like who the main character is and what is the path they travel. Some people have called like young adult the millennial genre or category, which I don't think is necessarily so wrong, but I don't know, because young adults read everything, right?
Yeah.
So.
But you didn't have to change how you wrote, though. Do you have to write towards a certain, what words you choose to describe something?
I didn't. Like, when I was a young adult, I had an adult reading level, which most kids who like to read will have an adult reading level when they read it. It's more on the structure of the story and how, like, yeah, how your characters develop and what sort of challenges they're facing.
Right, this takes place in 1945.
Yeah, in the fantasy version of 1940, 42, 43. Yeah.
How you doing?
But Lua, go ahead.
So I was just wondering, I read like a little bit about it in the author's note, but Ravna has, I'm not giving anything away, I promise, she has prosthetic legs.
That's true.
So what did you have to do as an author who does not have prosthetic legs to like find out about that?
Yeah, so first I looked up loads of resources. I did a lot with like memoirs of people who had become double amputees, because Ravna becomes a double amputee via accident. Then I did some interviews. The internet is great for finding random people who will be interviewed by you. And then I also had someone who does have a prosthetic to like look over things, technical and like language-wise, to see how they work. So we had two separate readers who did that.
Was it kind of scary writing about like something that you, I don't know, I mean, obviously every author writes about stuff that they haven't personally been through, but it's kind of a big.
It is a big thing. I think it's not so scary if you're willing to like learn and listen to it. It's the same sort of criticism as you'll get from an expert about being a doctor, or like being a scientist if you're gonna write something with scientists. So looking at it in that sense, that they're a professional through life experience, and should definitely be considered when you're writing. So it was fine.
Are your characters based on real life pilots?
Sort of. They're like amalgams. Nene is sort of an amalgamation of some sharpshooters that were some snipers in World War II, and like a Russian folk hero who dressed up as a man and helped unite Russia. And Revna is based off of, mainly off of Virginia Hall, who was actually a U.S. or an American spy for the British in France during World War II. She was the #1 most wanted member of the French resistance when she was there, and she climbed over the Pyrenees on a prosthetic leg, which I thought was pretty impressive. So I think a lot of my secondary characters are based on specific women pilots, much more than my two main girls.
This book is based in Russia,
Yes, it's based on fantasy Russia.
so what kind of, are you planning on marketing